Glorify his name. We came to worship him and give him all the praise. We magnify him with all of our hearts. In Christ we live, for you will never be apart. Oh yeah.
Welcome to Zion.
Say hey.
We come to praise.
Come on.
Welcome to Zion.
Give him the glory.
We come to bless his name.
Come on.
Welcome to Zion.
He deserves praise.
We come to praise.
Say
welcome his holy name.
all God's people came to glorify his name. We came to worship him and give him all the praise. We magnify him with all of our hearts. In Christ we live, for you will never be apart. Oh yeah.
Welcome to Zion.
Say hey.
We come to praise.
Come on.
Welcome to Zion.
Say oh.
We come to bless his name.
Come on.
Welcome to Zion.
Say hey.
We come to praise.
Lord, you welcome.
His holy.
Come on in this place. Lord, we need your spirit. Lord, you welcome. Tell me, do you feel that fire?
I feel it burning.
Do you feel that Holy Ghost fire?
I feel it all over me.
Tell me, do you feel that fire?
I feel it burning.
Do you feel that Holy Ghost fire?
I feel it all over me.
Can you feel them in your hands? Can you feel them in your feet? Tell me, do you feel that spirit?
I feel it all over me.
Can you feel them in your hands? Can you feel them in your feet? Tell me, do you feel that spirit?
I feel it all over me.
Tell me, do you feel that fire?
I feel it burning, burning.
Do you feel that Holy Ghost fire?
I feel it all over me.
Tell me, do you feel that fire?
I feel it burning, burning.
Can you feel that Holy Ghost fire?
I feel it all over me.
Do you feel them in your hands? Can you feel them in your feet? Tell me, do you feel that spirit?
I feel it all over me.
Hey, do you feel them in your hands? Can you feel them in your feet? Tell me, do you feel that spirit?
I feel it all over me.
Tell me, do you feel that spirit?
I feel it all over me.
Tell me, do you feel that spirit?
I feel it all over me.
Tell me, do you feel that spirit?
I feel it all over me.
Tell me, do you feel that spirit? Whoa, say glory. Help me say glory. Help me say glory. Hey, 'cause you know he's worthy. Your God is worthy. My God is worthy. Hey, help me say glory. He deserves the glory. He deserves the honor. Hey, help me say worthy. Help me say worthy. God is worthy. Hey, I feel him all over me. 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 I feel him all over me.
I got a fight out in my soul that I just can't shake. I was out in this world, y'all, and I still didn't break to what this old world was trying to offer me. Yeah. Even in my sins, he kept his hands on me, and I know it was God who lives inside of me. He gave me a crown, and now I have the victory. I am free.
I am free.
Yeah.
I am free indeed.
Indeed.
I am free.
Who the Son sets free.
I am free indeed.
Is set free indeed.
Indeed.
Even though I cause this pain and misery. Trusting people who really didn't have love for me. Doing things in this world that didn't honor you. You love me so much, Lord, still you pull me
It's your boy Track Star, your girl Angie. Verse 1.
Another morning, you see the sky was glowing. Drop on my knees to thank you because you're always faithful. Won't take another step until I tell you thank you, thank you. What would I look like if I never took the time to say just how much I'm grateful? So silly of me if I don't say thank you, thank you. Morning, new mercies, oh yes. What you done, thank you for rescue. Thank you. And I can't understand. You've always been there. Oh, I thank you. New mercies, I see. Thank you for rescue. Thank you. And I can't understand. I say thank you. I ain't got no time for stressing, 'cause I can't lose my blessing. I was lost for a while, but now I'm headed in a new direction. No one can to keep me down, no sin to keep me down. I say thank you, thank you. What would I look like if I never took the time to say just how much I'm thankful? So silly of me if I never say thank you, thank you, thank you. New mercies every morning I see. What you done, thank you for rescue. Everything you've done for me. You never left my side. And I say thank you, thank you, thank you. That's how you draw me out.
Hour Live FM.
Their YouTube empires.
NewsHour is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm James Kimarasamy. More new brooms for Ukraine as exit polls suggest a win for President Zelensky's party in parliamentary elections. But how will MPs with no previous political experience avoid the mistakes of the past?
This time around we're coming together in a whole new political party. Now we understand that we must try to build a new system with our new political party. As Iran shows images of the captured British oil tanker, its foreign minister claims that the US National Security Advisor John Bolton is dragging the UK into a quagmire.
The tweet reflects bewilderment. Not only is the UK not stepping in to de-escalate and keep hold of things, but it's moving things toward a very dangerous confrontation. And why the new head of Brazil's Indigenous Peoples Agency isn't inspiring confidence. All of that coming up after the news.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. The new Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's party, Servant of the People, has emerged well ahead of its rivals in parliamentary elections. The national exit polls suggest it got around 44% of the vote. Another new party, Voice, seems to have the 6% required to make up the shortfall. But with many seats decided in constituencies, the final outcome is hard to predict. Steve Rosenberg is at the President's electoral headquarters in Kiev.
If this exit poll is correct, and the national exit poll has in the past proved to be pretty correct, then 5 parties will be getting into the new parliament, clearing the 5% barrier. Volodymyr Zelensky's party, Servant of the People, is way out ahead, according to the exit poll, a long way ahead of the opposition platform for Life, which is a pro-Moscow bloc. But there are also another 199 individual candidates races going on around the country.
Violence has erupted in Hong Kong following another mass rally against the authorities. The police say they used tear gas after protesters threw bricks and petrol bombs. There are reports they've also fired rubber bullets. Earlier, more than 400,000 people turned out for a largely peaceful rally. The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa says he will seek an urgent judicial review of a report by the public prosecutor, which found he had misled Parliament over a campaign donation. Mr Ramaphosa has staked his reputation on fighting corruption. Andrew Harding reports from Pretoria.
President Ramaphosa was scathing about the claim that he deliberately misled Parliament last year. At the time, he denied receiving campaign funding from a controversial company, but later said he'd been misinformed. His critics have called for him to step down until the matter is resolved. But Mr Ramaphosa told a news conference he would carry on, and he vehemently rejected the public protector's serious allegations as fundamentally flawed and wrong in law. Not for the first time, it will now be left to South Africa's overworked courts to resolve what many here believe is fundamentally a political dispute.
The police in Nigeria say 4 Turkish nationals have been kidnapped in the west of the country. The 4 construction workers were seized in the Edo local government area of Kwara State. With more details, here's Ishaq Khalid.
The police spokesperson in the state, Okansanmi Ajayi, told the BBC the kidnapping happened at a local bar. It is not clear whether there were casualties during the abduction. The police have launched a rescue operation. Kidnappings for ransom are frequent in Nigeria. Both locals and expatriates are targeted by armed groups. On Tuesday, 10 Turkish sailors were taken hostage by pirates who attacked their cargo ship off the coast of Nigeria. They have yet to be freed.
BBC News. An official from the Sudanese opposition protest movement has confirmed that the Ethiopian authorities attempted to deport the leader of an armed group attending talks in the capital Addis Ababa. Jibril Ibrahim, the head of the Justice and Equality movement, was escorted with colleagues to the airport. Following the intervention of mediators from the African Union, the deportation was halted. One of India's most prominent Labour activists, Arun Kumar Roy, has died in the eastern city of Dhanbad. He was 84. A.K. Roy, as he was popularly known, was thrice elected as a Member of Parliament. In an age when more than 85% of India's MPs are millionaires, A.K. Roy had no bank account and did not own more than 2 shirts and 2 pairs of trousers, living alone in a desolate party office without electricity. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has praised Mexico's efforts to reduce the number of migrants reaching their border and said they should continue working together to increase prosperity and security in the region. Mr. Pompeo was speaking after a meeting in Mexico City. His counterpart, Marcelo Ebrard, said that Mexico would continue to oppose tough new US rules on migration. In the Netball World Cup final in Liverpool, New Zealand have beaten Australia to take the gold medal for the first time since 2003. The BBC's Kate Gray is outside the stadium.
This World Cup has thrown up many surprises. It's coming to an end here. Everyone leaving the arena after the medal ceremony, and all eyes were on the defending champions Australia throughout this tournament. And New Zealand have pretty much gone under the radar. Nobody was really backing them coming into this tournament, but they've proved everybody wrong. They've beaten the defending champions in a thrilling final, 52 goals to 51. A real clash of the titans, a real crowd pleaser for the arena here in Liverpool.
And that's the latest BBC News.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from our studios in central London. I'm James Kumarasamy. We begin today in Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky's decision to call a snap parliamentary election appears to have been vindicated. Exit polls suggest that his Servant of the People party, made up of people who, like him, are new to elected politics, has easily come top in the vote, but is likely to fall short of a majority. Mr. Zelensky, whose party is named after the television show that made him famous, thanked voters for placing their trust in him and his party.
73 would have been better, but we are very grateful, me in particular. Every one of us, we are grateful to the people of Ukraine for support. Let us applaud the people of Ukraine for their great trust in our party, in the Servant of the People.
That's 73, a reference to the percentage he got in his landslide victory in April's presidential election, of course. So let's speak to our correspondent Steve Rosenberg, who's in Kiev. And Steve, what are these exit polls suggesting the figure from this election is going to be?
Well, according to what's called the national exit poll in Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky's party, Servant of the People, has secured around 44% of the vote. That's well ahead of the 4 other parties which are predicted to make it into the new parliament. If you look down the list, the next party down is what's called the Opposition Platform for Life, which is a pro-Moscow party. That's set to get around 11.5%. European Solidarity, which is the party of the former president, Petro Poroshenko, 8.9%. So you can see that Servant of the People is well ahead. But to form a government, the party may well require a coalition partner. And I say may well because the makeup of the new parliament still isn't clear. Half the seats are decided by party lists, and that relates to the exit poll we've been talking about. Roughly the other half are decided by individual first-past-the-post contests between individual candidates in electoral districts. It'll take some time for those to be known.
And there's a possibility, is there not, that if a coalition is needed, it could be between a party of a president who comes up through the television comedy world with a rock star.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the most likely option for a coalition, if it is needed, would be between Servant of the People and a relatively new party called Holus, or The Voice, which is led by Ukraine's most famous rock star, Sviatoslav Vakarchuk. And I think that's a reflection, again, of all these new faces we are seeing in Ukrainian politics. Ukrainian voters seem to be disillusioned in the old way of doing things, the old style of politics. That is why Volodymyr Zelensky was elected by a landslide 3 months ago. That is why his party has done well in the parliamentary election. And is also why Vakarchuk's party, The Voice, seems to have cleared the 5% threshold and will be represented in the new parliament.
So a possible multimedia coalition. But what are the priorities now for Mr. Zelensky, now that he seems to have got a pretty strong backing in Parliament to go with his presidential win?
Yes, well, with this level of support that he's got in Parliament, I think he will consider this a mandate to push ahead with his reform programme. And both the President and his party say they want to do all sorts of things to shake up Ukraine and the political system, the economic system, the legal system. They're talking about passing a law on against illegal enrichment by Ukrainian officials. They're talking about removing MPs' immunity from prosecution. There's also talk about a law on presidential impeachment, electoral reform. There's a long list of reforms that President Zelensky says he wants to carry out. Having said that, he does have his critics. There are people in Ukraine who believe he's too close to a powerful tycoon, Igor Kolomoisky. Now, the president denies that. The businessman denies that too. There are skeptics who believe that, well, we've seen it all before. We've seen people who've come into power and believe that they can reform the country and nothing's come of it. But I think the election results today seem to indicate that for now, many Ukrainians want to keep faith, are prepared to keep faith in this showman president and in his party.
Steve, thanks very much. The BBC Steve Rosenberg in Kiev. Well, lots of new faces are expected, some of them pretty young faces. 22-year-old Sviatoslav Jurash is expected, if these exit poll results are borne out, to become one of the MPs from Mr Zelensky's Servant of the People party.
This parliament will be completely composed of, especially from our side, will be composed of people who were never members of parliament before, because Ukrainians are very tired of those individuals who have been in politics for the last 28 years and who let them down continuously. We very much aim to build the reality that Ukrainians wanted for the last 28 years.
28 years since independence, of course, and during that time you were born. You're a young man. What is it that got you into politics?
This election cycle, the reality is presidential elections were first, and in these elections Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has won 73% of the vote, because that's how amazingly tired Ukrainians were of the previous politicians trying to continuously cling to power. And when I would join him for the presidential elections, after that, parliamentary elections seemed to be a rational next step where we can work with the president to try and get things done.
What do you bring personally?
I work in foreign policy. Ever since I came back to Ukraine for my foreign studies, I was focused on developing Ukrainian national connections. First at the Maidan Revolution in 2014, as I founded the international center there with the work with the media and with with embassies in Ukraine and with Ukrainian diaspora. Besides that, I also was the secretary of the Civil Council for that parliamentary committee, which I'll be joining in Parliament.
What difference do you think it will make to Ukraine to have a parliament with large numbers of people who have not directly been involved in the political process before?
To be honest with you, these people have been deeply engaged with politics, just not in a way of parliamentarian sort. This is the people who have been at the revolution, the last one or the one before that. These are people who have been battling corruption for their entire life. These are people who are engaged deep way with civil society. These are people who are extremely political. Just they haven't had a chance to actually implement all the ideas they have developed.
You will be aware, since you were involved in the Euromaidan revolution, that these were exactly the things that were being said directly after that, but a lot of people were disappointed. How can you ensure that the same disappointment doesn't happen again?
Because this time we come prepared. We have the last 5 years of various people in the parliament who have been making many mistakes, making many compromising alliances, and for us it's very clear what to avoid, because we have the last 5 years to look back on as example of what not to do when you are in parliament.
What mistakes specifically are you going to try and avoid?
So first, it's the alliances with the old oligarchic systems that have been promising the world and delivering nothing, first and foremost. Second, it's joining the old parties. That's why this time around we're coming together in a whole new political party. Previously, these people that joined the parliament, these were the people who have joined existing parties, trying to build alliances and trying to change the system from within. Now we understand that we must try to build a new system with our new political party.
22-year-old Sviatoslav Jurash expected to become an MP in the Ukrainian parliament. Well, Andrei Kurkov is a Ukrainian writer and political commentator who's best known internationally for his novel Death and the Penguin. From Ukraine's Odessa region, he told me what he thought the results of this election would mean.
I think it will be a huge effect, actually, an impact on the country. It's a new phase in the political history of the country, because we have completely new set in the parliament, and the parties which used to be the headliners parties and the most important ones are practically turning into dust. So we will have a lot of unexperienced people, completely unknown to the voters. But this shows actually trust in the new president, and it shows quite an adventurous way ahead for Ukraine, I think.
What's different to 2014? What's different this time to just 5 years ago when the revolution took place? You and I stood in the Maidan on the very night that there was a change of power in Ukraine. A lot of the hopes then were very high, but they were dashed. What's different this time?
Well, it's different kind of hopes now, and these hopes actually are mostly connected with the economical issues, partially with the war in Donbass also. But generally, the main message of the voters is that they are fed up with all the political elite of Ukraine. So they are prepared to take risk and to elect and to have completely unknown personalities as their leaders and ministers and statesmen. And of course, I mean, there is a huge risk, and most of the intellectuals are quite sarcastic about the events, but the majority of population seems happy.
How do you look with your satirical writer's eye on the reality of political life now in Ukraine, with a president who came up through television comedy, talking about going into coalition with a party led by one of the top rock stars in the country, a sort of multimedia coalition going on in Parliament?
These were television elections. I mean, in fact, I was thinking that we are having competition between three main TV channels, not between political parties. So, I mean, like the TV channels were playing the roles of the political parties, and the TV channel which won, 1+1 TV channel, which created Zelensky as the showman and comedian and actor. I mean, they will have now to work hard to create a real, physically existing political force. And I think it will be very difficult. It will be difficult, and it will be accompanied by lots of very funny situations. And since Zelensky himself spent 20 years in the TV studio making fun of practically of almost all politicians in Ukraine except pro-Russian politicians, I think and I hope there will be new comedians with much bigger talent, which will mock whatever is done or announced by Zelensky and his party. Because, I mean, without this balance between satire and reality, Ukraine will not survive.
Are you optimistic for the future now? More optimistic than you've been for some time?
I'm more optimistic now than I was after presidential elections. I accepted the results. I was not happy, and I am not happy still. But I can see that actually, I mean, if the majority of voters are happy, I shouldn't be criticizing majority, but I will follow very closely. And actually, I mean, you know, there is not a right who supports Zelensky and his party. Everybody is aggressively against him. So we will see how intellectuals of Ukraine will practically comment on what is done by Zelensky and his party in the parliament, in the government, in presidential administration.
And that was the Ukrainian writer and commentator Andrei Kurkov. You're listening to the BBC World Service, and this is News Hour, coming to you live from our studios in central London with James Kimarasamy. out later on in the programme, a mixture of mood and meaning. We'll find out what happens when a jazz and a classical virtuoso make music together.
Throughout the four movements, you have every type of, euphoria, intimacy, dance.
So every time I write a piece, I try to deal with literal aspects of the piece, then metaphorical aspects of it, and metaphysical.
Our headlines at this hour. Exit polls in Ukraine suggest that President Volodymyr Zelensky's party will win the largest number of seats in parliament, but fall short of an overall majority. And riot police in Hong Kong have used tear gas and batons against protesters who refused to disperse after the latest mass demonstration against the authorities. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm James Kumarasamy. We started with Ukraine, a country with a TV comedian turned president. We move now to another country where fact and fiction seem to be blurring in public policy. France announced this week that its army is forming a red team of science fiction writers who will imagine possible future threats or perhaps future plots. The writers' creative thoughts are supposed to complement more traditional military planning. But France isn't the first country to have the idea.
We've lost the East Coast. Moscow's still dark. Life as we know it will come to an end in 90 days. It's on us to change that. I can't leave my family.
That Brad Pitt zombie apocalypse film, World War Z, was based on a book by an author who also teaches at America's West Point Military Academy. He is, and this is fact not fiction, Max Brooks, the son of A-list actors Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft.
World War Z or World War Z was much more of a grand strategy book, and that was required reading at our U.S. Naval War College, and it was also read by General Odierno, who's command of our forces in Iraq. World War Z really does just talk about a brand new threat no one was expecting, and we first try to go up against the threat in the old way. The old way doesn't work. We take a beating, and then we adapt. And we adapt at every level of society. So that's how World War Z was an example of what human beings can do when we need to change and we need to grow. I lecture to cadets about what it takes to get an idea from your head out into the real world.
In your world, in the world of writing, of films, that's embraced. But in the military world, is that embraced?
It's pretty much the same. What I go through, even in the publishing world or in Hollywood, is really no different from what they go through in the military, because Hollywood has wonderful ideas coming at them all the time. But if those ideas don't have a champion to run them up the chain of command, those ideas, usually in the form of screenplays, will sit on a shelf. And those screenplays gathering dust are no different than the mountains of military reports that are gathering dust in archives all over the world.
So is the idea to sprinkle some gold dust over their ideas?
The idea is to be a champion, because it's wonderful to have, let's say, a colonel that's running a working group, say, of science fiction writers within the military sphere. And those science fiction writers can come up with some amazing scenarios that will eventually save lives. But that colonel then needs to take those ideas and champion them to the generals above him.
Is that the problem then, or has it traditionally been the problem that those higher up the chain have not wanted to hear those ideas?
That is exactly the problem. And we saw that problem in an ocean of blood about 100 years ago. You had people being slaughtered by the millions every single day because of a handful of crusty old generals who had come of age several decades earlier. And the world had changed and they hadn't. And new ideas of warfare had come about that could have ended the slaughter, but they weren't willing to hear it. They were still stuck in an age of cavalry and flags and charges and elan, and they were butting up against the cold, hard science of the machine gun and mustard gas, and they were not willing to adapt.
You've used a nice French word there to introduce us to the concept of the French military having this unit now with 4 or 5 science fiction writers coming up with new future ideas of the kind of threats that the country might face. What do you think of that?
It's a great start because there is at least a fundamental understanding, certainly at the lower levels, the world is changing more rapidly than we could have ever imagined. And we cannot afford another failure of imagination. We need to have as much creativity and as much thought thrown at these problems as we can. And this is not just a French idea. We do it at the Modern War Institute. The Atlantic Council in America has done it through the Art of Future Warfare. I'm sure the British are doing it, and I guarantee you the Russians and the Chinese are doing it. But it is only a start.
And that was the science fiction writer, military trainer and son of Hollywood royalty, Max Brooks. Brazil's indigenous population is said to be stunned and worried by President Bolsonaro's choice of a federal police officer with links to agricultural businesses as the next head of the FUNAI agency, the national body that oversees indigenous affairs. Critics say it effectively puts the fate of the Amazon rainforest and its inhabitants in the hands of an industry that wants to exploit and destroy it. Mr. Bolsonaro's supporters say developing the area will bring much-needed economic development to Brazil's native people. Well, Sarah Schenker is a researcher at Survival International, an organisation that campaigns for the rights of indigenous peoples, and she joins us now. Sarah Schenker, tell us about this person that's been appointed and why indigenous people are so concerned.
Hello. Yes, Marcelo Xavier, who has been appointed to be the next president of FUNAI, the Indigenous Affairs Department of the Brazilian government, is bad news for indigenous peoples because he is very likely to toe the line of President Bolsonaro, who has practically declared war on Brazil's indigenous population since taking presidency in January this year. And he's tried all sorts of ways to open up indigenous people's land and steal that land for exploitation, for agribusiness, and also for large-scale mining. And of course, for indigenous peoples, this is catastrophic because indigenous peoples depend completely on that land for their survival. You know, it gives them their food, their medicine, their housing, absolutely everything. And uncontacted tribes who have no regular contact with mainstream society stand to lose the most. In fact, it's a genocide that we're seeing at the moment. It's an extreme situation.
Well, what does this position then as head of the agency actually allow someone to do? Why does it make such a difference?
Well, this agency, FUNAI, is responsible for mapping out and protecting indigenous people's territory. And given that land is fundamental, that means that FUNAI is absolutely key to indigenous people's survival. And that is why indigenous people are very much against the appointment of this Mr. Xavier as the head of FUNAI. They want somebody who's going to stand up for them, who's going to fight alongside them for their rights to be respected, rather than towing the line of the agribusiness lobby, which just wants to open up their land. But actually, it's quite interesting because whilst we say that this would be terrible, this appointment to FUNAI of Marcelo Xavier, at the same time, we see that the indigenous movement in Brazil is becoming much stronger. And earlier this year, Brazilian Indians led the biggest ever international protest for indigenous rights. And their strength and their demands are actually ensuring that President Bolsonaro doesn't always get his way. So they have actually managed so far this year to halt several administrative moves that President Bolsonaro was trying to make that would enable him and his colleagues to steal indigenous people's land. So it's not all terrible.
What about the argument that is made, and I know obviously you disagree vehemently with the way it's being enacted and this appointment, but the argument that actually there is an economic benefit to be had for indigenous people in a degree, an amount of development?
That is just not true, because the sort of so-called development that President Bolsonaro and his colleagues are pushing is not going to help indigenous people at all. It's just for big business. It's a sort of so-called development that will bring big profit to big business, but will not help indigenous people or other minorities in Brazil. And also, of course, there's never any justification for doing anything which is likely to put whole populations at risk. We're talking about uncontacted tribes which could be wiped out by this. And of course, that's completely against the Brazilian constitution and international law.
Sarah Schenker. We have to leave it there. Sarah Schenker from Survival International. You're listening to the BBC World Service, and this is News Hour, coming to you live from London with James Kimarasamy.
Now on the BBC World Service.
50,000 feet above the lunar surface. Since emerging from the dark side of the moon, communications between the spacecraft and Houston have been erratic. The atmosphere in mission control is tense and uneasy. And there's a race against fuel. On the 20th of July, 1969, Apollo 11 made a giant leap. But in its last 13 minutes, it almost didn't land. NASA's most daring mission, and one of the most momentous days in human history, told by the people who, one night in the summer of 1969, took man to the moon. 13 minutes to the moon.
Listen to the whole series now at bbcworldservice.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Coming up on News Hour in the next 30 minutes, the Soviet space capsule that was racing Apollo 11 to the moon. The latest on the international tanker row. Iran's foreign minister accuses the US National Security Advisor of dragging the UK into a quagmire. What happens when jazz and classical music virtuosos get together, and Pakistan's Prime Minister heads to the White House. All of that after the news.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. Exit polls in Ukraine's parliamentary elections suggest the party of President Volodymyr Zelensky will win most seats. Analysts suggest it could govern in a coalition with another new party. Riot police in Hong Kong have used tear gas and batons against protesters who refused to disperse after the latest mass demonstration against the authorities. Police say demonstrators threw bricks and petrol bombs. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa will seek a judicial review of a report alleging he misled Parliament over campaign funds. He said the public prosecutor's findings were not rational. Ethiopian authorities have been prevented from deporting the leader of a Sudanese armed opposition group after the African Union intervened. Jibril Ibrahim had been taken to the airport in Addis Ababa. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has praised Mexico's efforts to reduce the number of migrants reaching their border and said they should continue working together to increase prosperity and security in the region. Mr. Pompeo's comments come after a meeting in Mexico City with his counterpart, Marcelo Ebrard. Egypt has criticised British Airways for its decision to suspend its flights to Cairo for a week on security grounds. The civil aviation minister said the firm did not consult authorities. Firefighters in Portugal say they've brought 85% of a wildfire under control. 13 tanker planes have been dousing the blaze. One of India's most prominent Labour activists, Arun Kumar Roy, has died at the age of 84. The veteran left-winger was respected across the political spectrum. In golf, Shane Lowry of Ireland has claimed his first major championship win with victory at the British Open with a 6-shot victory. And New Zealand
so that they could claim to have done it first and with no risk to human life. As far as Luna 15 was concerned, all one received was the telemetry.
Any signal they're getting from its instruments to say what state it's in and how it's operating.
That's right. When you came to Apollo, that was completely different.
182 inertial, I'm going inertial now.
You had the voices of the astronauts as they talked to ground control, and they retransmitted the voices of the ground controllers talking to the astronauts.
You could hear the whole conversation?
So you could hear both sides of the conversation.
Ready to copy, LOI 2.
This is Sunday, July the 20th. The sounds we can hear in the background are the commands from Luna 15 and also the voices from the Apollo 11 spacecraft now in orbit around the moon.
The Russian probe did eventually attempt to land on the moon's surface, but that's when the mission came to an untimely end.
Time is 15:50, 20 seconds.
Apollo 11 landed on the moon on the 20th of July at 8:15 in the evening. The following day, Luna 15 crashed onto the surface of the moon at 4:10 in the afternoon.
So Luna 15 crashed just 2 hours?
Just 2 hours before Apollo 11 lifted off from the surface of the moon.
Well, that we believe to have been the landing of Luna 15, and meanwhile in the background you'll hear the voices of the Apollo astronauts on the moon.
How much did it hit home what you were witnessing?
I think it finally struck home when one saw the pictures on television, and then you walked out of your house and looked up into the sky and saw the moon and said, human beings have walked on that moon. And then you think, and I picked up the signals from them.
I say, this is really the drama of the highest order.
And that was the retired engineer Bob Pritchard talking to our science correspondent Victoria Gill. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is News Hour, coming to you live from our studios in central London with James Kumarasamy. The UK and Iran's tit-for-tat tanker row rumbles on 2 days after the Iranians seized a British-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for the earlier detention of one of their vessels off the coast of Gibraltar. Well, Iranian television has today been showing images of the British vessel, the Stena Impero, with an Iranian flag fluttering over it. Separately, a recording has been released of a radio exchange between a Royal Navy warship and an Iranian patrol boat shortly before the tanker was boarded by Iranian Revolutionary Guards on Friday. The excerpt that has been made public begins with what appears to be the Iranian vessel warning the Stena Impero to change course.
You are ordered to change your course to 360 degrees immediately. If you obey, you will be safe.
This is British warship Foxtrot 236. So I reiterate that as you are conducting transit passage in a recognised international strait, under international law, your passage must not be impaired.
This is a Sapar Navy patrol boat. No challenge is intended. No challenge is intended. I want to inspect the ship for security reason, over.
Please confirm that you are not intending to violate international law by unlawfully attempting to board.
I asked the UK's Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood for his response to that recording.
I reiterate the words of the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary that this is a hostile act. This is a ship that was in full compliance of international maritime law, operating in respected sea lanes in the Straits of Hormuz. The Iranians initially claimed there was a collision with a fishing vessel, then there was an oil spill. Most concerningly, which may fit in with the recording that you had, is the ship then went dark. Its transponders were then switched off, which does mean that getting access to it and understanding where it exactly is, it obviously causes problems. It then moved into Iranian territorial waters, and this is, an example of state piracy. And we need to de-escalate this, because this isn't an event in its isolation. As you know, there's been a series of events that have taken place over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and as part of a wider geopolitical tensions that are raised too. So we need to take measured steps to reduce the tensions, to ensure that we get the British flagship back into international waters, but ultimately look to resolve the wider dispute that there is between Iran and the West.
The British Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood. Well, Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has also reacted to the row today, suggesting on Twitter that President Trump's National Security Advisor John Bolton, a well-known Iran hawk, is, quote, turning his venom against the UK in hopes of dragging it into a quagmire. So what message is he trying to send? Azadeh Marveni is a former Middle East correspondent for Time magazine and an Iran analyst.
It seems to me that he's signalling to the UK, look, don't do this.
is very much a tweet that suggests that from Tehran's perspective, this is a really hostile act, keeping this Iranian vessel as long as it has. But second, I think it reflects that, from the Iranian view, they don't see the UK acting here. They see the UK acting on behalf of the US, on behalf of the Bolton Plan, which has been very, very much aggressive and kind of designed to move the two countries towards confrontation.
Is he just trying to poke at the UK in a sense, saying, look, you're being dragged into something unwittingly?
The UK was supposed to be playing a special role here, okay? It was meant to be helping reduce tensions. It was meant to be getting this financial vehicle running to help Iran import basic food and essential medicines. It was kind of meant to be the lead to salvage the deal. So I think the tweet reflects bewilderment. Not only is the UK not kind of stepping in to de-escalate and keep hold of things, but it's kind of stepping in line with Bolton and moving things toward a very dangerous confrontation.
So, in a sense, warning the UK then that not to side with the Americans over the other Europeans when it comes to Iran?
I don't know if the tone of it is a warning so much as a signal. I think it's really important to underscore that the oil is the lifeblood of the Iranian economy. Essentially, I think that the message is, look, we control the Strait of Hormuz. If we cannot sail our ships around the world, if we cannot sell our oil, which is essentially the way that we feed 83 million people, then there are going to be tensions for everyone.
And now, of course, we have the British ship that's being held and displayed on Iranian TV with an Iranian flag on it. So tensions rising.
It's pretty much standard. I think Iran will wait and bid its time, and I think its leadership, is playing the cautious game, but it will eventually fight back. And I think it's done that in a very calibrated way and in a cautious way. But it's an existential moment for Iran. If it cannot sell its oil, it will be in real economic jeopardy. So I think that, it calibrates a response just enough to show how much it's hurting. But I don't think that it genuinely, wants things to escalate, but it cannot show weakness at the same time.
And where do you stand on this question of the influence that John Bolton really has, whether or not Donald Trump is listening to him or pushing back against his desire to drag America into a war?
Well, he's been hugely influential. I think that, even if he represents, a hawkish minority, perhaps even within the Republican establishment, he's been holding this file, and he has gutted, a multilateral deal and kind of pushed the Middle East into far greater instability than perhaps any time in the last 15 years. At the same time, Donald Trump is famously capricious, and he faces re-election imminently, and I think is very aware that his base has no appetite for another Middle Eastern war. So I think this is the luck of timing in a way that is what prevents John Bolton from seeing his dream of war realized.
What might de-escalate the situation, do you think? Who's going to make the first move?
It's incredibly delicate because whatever the UK does, will resound so much more loudly than this particular situation. I think given how this whole tanker incident unfolded, it began with the UK, and the Spanish said as much, very irregularly and probably unlawfully seizing an Iranian ship. If that's how it started, it seems reasonable for the UK to take the first step towards de-escalation. But, on the week where Boris Johnson, assumes the position of number 10, it's hard to see stepping down or stepping back as his first move, given kind of what we know about the dreams of his relationship with the White House.
Azadeh Marveni ending with a reference to the likely next British Prime Minister. We'll find out for sure on Tuesday whether or not Boris Johnson has won the Conservative Party leadership contest, and we'll have full coverage of it all here on NewsHour. Classical and jazz are two musical genres which tend to operate in separate orbits. But a collaboration between the star violinist Nicola Benedetti and the jazz legend Wynton Marsalis has brought those two worlds together. Their recent album includes a violin concerto which he wrote for her and a suite of fiddle tunes. Our special correspondent James Naughty has been speaking to this pair of very different virtuosos about how they found a common path.
Well, I sat down with Nikki and got her what she wanted the piece to be. And from knowing her, one thing she talks about all the time is dreams. So
explain the business of dreaming, Nicola. How is it that became the spirit of the piece?
I think it's just something I must refer to a lot, dreams and nightmares, and it became kind of how the first movement plays out is juxtaposing very, very different states and extreme states.
Because it starts relatively calmly and ends in a kind of cacophony.
Yes, well, the first movement starts calm and quite quickly goes into a kind of nightmare feel, but throughout the four movements you have every type of, euphoria, intimacy, dance.
So every time I write a piece, I try to deal with literal aspects of the piece, then metaphorical aspects of it, and metaphysical. So literally, yes, it is a dream. So it goes from one thing to the next, but it could be anything. But metaphorically, the dream is her coming into your city, playing a concerto, and you get to transport yourself from where you are to that place. And metaphysical, it says that the whole spiritual belief that all of this is a dream.
I want to ask you, Nicola Benedetti, what it was like getting your head around this music.
It wasn't hard for me to understand what the emotional content, what was required of the music. It was just hard to execute it because it required me to depart quite far from my physical and kind of typical styles of playing my instrument. But I do think that's like the largest responsibility of you as a classical, quote unquote, classical musician, is to go deep inside worlds that are far from yours.
And you've got to produce in the last movement ecstasy, really, haven't you? It's wild. It's joyous.
Yeah, absolutely, and one that's not frivolous at all. So it's like very uplifting and euphoric, but harsh at the same. Is that right? Winston, did you say it's hot? Like it's got a harsh.
Yeah, it's always hard edge because of the 2-beat feel and the kind of groove. Yeah. The aspect of the groove is not light.
There's a second piece on the album which is a fiddle dance suite. And fiddle rather than violin. And this dance suite it's just full of the folk tradition. I mean, they just throbs with it.
Yeah, absolutely, and how the various musical components have been merged in each movement so successfully. Things that, to me, from an abstract perspective or a distance, seemed like that they may not fuse. Actually, they became so natural. The more and the Straspe in particular, that's probably one of my highlights. I love playing that movement.
You're happy you did it?
Yeah, I learned a lot. And a lot of it was due to the education and the micro attention to detail that I learned from her.
And if you were going to say to someone listening to this who's not a normal consumer of classical music, and they thought, that sounds interesting, I might want to listen to this, what would you tell them to expect?
Just some colorful music that we wrote and played, and we want people who are curious about music to check it out, because we want to challenge people's listenings and take them into another world of things and possibilities. And we're trying to get better as musicians and as writers, and we hope they want to get better as listeners.
Wynton Marsalis and Nicola Benedetti, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that report was from James Naughty. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service.
Now let's look at what else you can hear from the BBC World Service.
In 10 minutes, we're on the cultural front line. Here's Tina Dahili.
What's it like being a world-famous YouTuber at just 20 years old? India's online sensation Ajay Nagar and Iraqi Sudanese comedy star Maha Jaffer tell us how they built their YouTube empires.
And then the final part of our series exploring how hate has been stoked throughout history.
I felt the heavy-handedness of the system. I actually realized how evil the system is.
That's followed by 50 more things that made the modern economy.
Demand for rubber boomed. Europe's colonial powers set about clearing vast areas of Asia to plant Hevea brasiliensis, more widely known as the rubber tree.
That's all still to come here on the BBC World Service. Now it's back to NewsHour.
Reminder of our top story this hour. Exit polls in Ukraine suggest that President Volodymyr Zelensky's party will win the largest number of seats in parliament, but will fall short of an overall majority. Earlier we had this assessment of the vote from Andrei Kurkov, the Ukrainian writer and political commentator.
I think it will be a huge effect, actually, an impact on the country. It's a new phase in the political history of the country, because we have completely new set in the parliament, and the parties which used to be the headliners parties and the most important ones are practically turning into dust.
One other headline at this hour. Riot police in Hong Kong have used tear gas and batons against protesters who refuse to disperse after the latest mass demonstration against the authorities. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour, coming to you live from our studios in central London with James Kumarasamy. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is meeting President Trump at the White House on Monday. It is his first visit to the United States since taking office last year and follows a long spell of tension between the two countries. A year and a half ago, Mr. Trump announced that he would suspend aid to Pakistan until the country ended its relationship with a number of terrorist groups. He had previously tweeted that Pakistan had, quote, given nothing but lies and deceit in exchange for $33 billion in aid. So, what should we expect from this meeting? Cameron Munter is an independent consultant who was the US ambassador to Pakistan between 2010 and 2012. Shuja Nawaz is a political and strategic analyst with the South Asia Centre at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Does he think Pakistan's Prime Minister is hoping for a reset of the two countries' relationship?
I think both sides want to reset the relationship because the break in the relationship has not helped either. Of course, it has hurt Pakistan much more because it was part of an unequal alliance with the United States, and it has suffered on the economic front, especially because of the shutdown of U.S. assistance. And now it is resetting by getting the U.S. to assist not only the international financial institutions, get aid to Pakistan, but also to get Pakistan off the blacklist of the Financial Action Task Force, which has been examining Pakistan's dealings with money laundering and terror financing.
Cameron Munter, do you think President Trump is open to a reset?
I think he is, and I think that the two leaders have a remarkable opportunity here. They're both charismatic leaders who are people who, really want to see if they can make a breakthrough. As Shuja Nawaz has mentioned, the relationship has been a troubled one, and it's been basically one that has been defined by geostrategic and counterterrorism issues. I think what we may find is that both of these leaders, perhaps contradicting their advisors, may focus more on economics, on the financial crisis, fiscal crisis in Pakistan, the opportunities for business for America. They may concentrate on that more than the traditional concentration that their advisors have on counterterrorism and geostrategic issues, such as the future of Afghanistan or these other terrorist questions.
And Shuja Nawaz, an interesting move by Prime Minister Khan to make the army chief the head of the National Economic Council. I guess that chimes with what Cameron Munter was saying about the economic aspect rising to the top.
I don't think he's the head of the council, but he's certainly in the council and will probably have the loudest voice. And importantly, also, this is, in recent memory, the first time that the Prime Minister has brought the army chief with him, as well as the intelligence chief on a visit to the United States. This is a departure with the past because it indicates that the army and the civil are on the same page as the government insists. And also, some critics will note that this may be a way for the military to ensure that it keeps an eye on what goes on in Washington, because in the past, civilian prime ministers would come and privately complain bitterly about the military, and there was a sharp divide between the two. That is apparently no longer the case, although within Pakistan that still remains an unequal partnership.
And Cameron Munter, beyond the chemistry between the two leaders, there is, though, a deep well of distrust in the United States, isn't there, that they will have to overcome if they want to get a relationship back on a better footing?
Yes, I think the mistrust is on both sides. I think that the American notion has been that the Pakistanis have not done what they said they would do, and the Pakistanis have believed that the Americans have left them in the lurch and not supported them as they should. I think one of the things that could be a change here, I'm not sure it will happen, is that if the context of the relationship changes from a strictly utilitarian or even kind of instrumental relationship of people fighting terrorism and defined by this counterterrorism fight and by geostrategic issues, if it changes a little bit more towards a relationship based on mutual benefit of economic issues, Imran Khan being able to deal with his financial crisis, the United States looking for opportunities for trade and investment overseas, it could change the feeling, the context and the atmosphere of the relationship, and maybe give it a new chance and get past some of the difficulties that Shuja Nawaz mentioned at the very beginning.
And Shuja Nawaz, does the Prime Minister come into this meeting from a position of domestic strength, or does he need to get something from this to show to the audience back in Pakistan? Is this a sort of a big meeting for him?
Well, he's begun the uphill task of resetting the economy, which is in dire straits, as Cameron Munter also explained. There's a fiscal crisis, taxes are down, foreign direct investment is down, and there's going to be a shortage of resources at a time when he needs to be growing at close to 6 or 7% just to stay even. And the current growth rate in Pakistan is below 4%. So the United States can help with trade measures by opening U.S. borders to imports from Pakistan, particularly by lowering tariffs to at least the European levels. It can also play a regional role in assisting Pakistan to reopen its borders with India and with Afghanistan and connecting it to Central Asia. So that kind of trade will give an enormous boost to Pakistan's economy.
And briefly, Cameron Munter, what about Congress? Where does it stand on this? Because it often doesn't see eye to eye with the president.
I think that in general, there is great Pakistan fatigue, the phrase people have used, Pakistan fatigue in Washington, a feeling that in the definition of our greatest challenge, which was the post-9/11 effort to try to eradicate the terrorism and to win the war in Afghanistan, there's a sense in Congress, there's a sense in the Washington bureaucracy that Pakistan has not been a good partner. So I think the president will have probably some resistance if he chooses to reignite, say, or to rebuild the relationship, mainly looking at economics. People will say, but what about the way that Pakistan hasn't worked in the past? There's going to be an issue here that, it's not going to be easy to follow through on a lot of these initiatives if they show up.
And we heard there from the former US ambassador to Pakistan, Cameron Munter, and from Shuja Nawaz, a political and strategic analyst with the South Asia Centre at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., which is where Prime Minister Imran Khan will be meeting President Trump on Monday. That brings us to an end of this edition of News Hour. From me, James Kamarasamy, and the rest of the team here in London. Thanks very much for listening. Until the next time, goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing you inspirational stories from around the world.
I love the human stories.
Listening to the stories and just getting my mind off of everyday troubles and worries.
I have never stopped listening.
From an Eritrean man who spent his life on the run, to an FBI agent who looked into the souls of serial killers, an albino busker who went from the streets of Malawi to working with Madonna, and a Cuban socialite turned urban guerrilla fighting to bring.
And in 30 minutes, we join Alan Little.
In the final part of A History of Hate, I'll explore how South Africa's apartheid system...
SBR Live FM.
Fill this place. Bring us healing with your warm embrace. Show your power, make your presence known. Holy Spirit, come fill this place. Breath of God, we need a touch from you. Shine down on us with your light of truth. Stir our hearts and set our spirits free. Holy Spirit, come fill this place. Holy Spirit, come fill this. Holy Spirit, come and fill this place.
All hail King Jesus, all hail Emmanuel. Give him glory and honor and worship to his name, Jesus. He died on Calvary, but he rose again to set me free. Give him glory and honor and worship. His name is Jesus. All hail King Jesus. All hail Emmanuel. Give him glory and honor and worship to his name, Jesus. He died on Calvary, but he rose again to set me free. Give him glory and honor and worship. His name is Jesus. Give him glory, honor, and worship. His name is Jesus.
on a hill that I can always run to. Your love's illuminating still. Why would I turn my back on you? You've washed me whiter than the snow, refined my broken heart to gold. How did I ever walk alone without your perfect love? So come alive, let love rise, love shine through the night, ignite the sky with your marvelous light, radiate your perfect love to all the broken and all who come. So come alive, let your love arise. With you I am strong, your love will never fail me. You've placed me on a rock to shine this never-ending love. You bled upon the cross to save, put death in the blackest grave. Let your kingdom come today, Lord, let your kingdom come. So come alive, let love rise, love shine through the night, ignite the sky with your marvelous light, radiate your perfect love to all the broken and all who come. So come alive, let your love arise, open my heart and let it shine. Your perfect love that has redeemed my life. Open my heart and let it shine. Your perfect love that has redeemed my life. Love shine through the night, ignite the sky with your marvelous light, radiate your perfect love to all the broken and all who come. Love shine through the night, ignite the sky with your marvelous light, radiate your perfect love to all the broken and all who come. Love shine through the night, ignite the sky with your marvelous light, radiate your perfect love to all the broken and all who come. So come alive, let your love arise. Yeah, come alive, let your love arise.
May thy rich grace impart strength to my fainting heart, my zeal inspire.
Change true cause. You reached and found me hurting when I was wandering round. Now my shame's been wiped away, and I give glory to your name. My life is dedicated to you. So make my lips an instrument of your praise. Make my hands an instrument of your peace. Make my heart a vessel filled with purity. Let my life, oh Lord, honor you. In your sanctuary is where I want to be. Available to serve you. Whatever you need. Lord, I put on your garment. I'll never be the same. Never be the same. A vessel of honor to you. An instrument of your praise. My hands, an instrument of your peace. Make my heart a vessel filled with purity. Let my life, oh Lord, I create for this purpose, to magnify your name. You have restored my broken spirit. You have restored. Release my soul to praise. An instrument of your praise. My hands, an instrument of your peace. My heart, vessel, and my life, oh Lord, honor you. Make my heart a vessel filled with purity. Let my life, oh Lord, honor you. I want to praise you.
Many times in my childhood we traveled so far. By nightfall, how weary I'd grow. My father's arm would slip around me, and gently he'd say, "My child, we are going home." Going home, I'm going home. There is nothing to hold me here. Now the twilight is fading, and the day soon shall end. I get homesick the farther I roam, but the Father has led me each step of the way, and now He will lead me home. Going home, I am going home. There is nothing to hold me here. I've caught a glimpse of that heavenly land. Praise God, we are going home. Going home, I'm going home. There is nothing to hold me here. I've caught a glimpse of that heavenly land. Praise God. Praise God. Praise God. We are going
Saints, I need